Our next speaker is Neil Lantzke, who's an independent agronomist. The title of his talk is WA Benchmarking Horticultural Resource Use, PNRM, DBCA, NLP, and he'll explain what all those acronyms mean in his talk, I'm sure. Neil's an independent agricultural scientist with 30 years' experience as a consultant, project manager, researcher, and grower. He provides agronomic advice, training, research, feasibility assessment, property development, project, and farm management. Now, when I asked him about his best sporting achievement, he just did one up on Peter Batt, which was, in cricket, 5 for 26. Well, Neil was 5 for 18, but then unfortunately got hit at the ground to end up 5 for 50. But it was going to be better than you, Peter, at one stage. In terms of most famous person he's met, Heston Blumenthal, quite recently on Minderoo Station, looking at pasture effects on meat quality. And I don't know if you've met Heston, but I know so he did some work for Coles, and he's pretty out there. He's well ahead of the curve, shall we say? And so welcome to Neil.
Red light on me? Which button is that one?
That's the
that one there.
blazer.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk on the resource issues facing horticulture in the southwest of WA. And for me, the biggest resource issue is water. If you look at the groundwater around Perth, or even going right up to Jurien Bay, it's fully allocated. And in fact, if you look at the area around Wanneroo, Carrabuta, it's over-allocated, and there's talk about clawing back whether it's 10% of that water off growers or 25%. So the groundwater resources are fully allocated, and it's the same if you go up into the Perth Hills there. There's no more water that can be accessed. So on top of that, we've got climate change, and I'll talk about that in a minute and what that's going to mean to the water resources. But the answer is we need to be more efficient with our irrigation, and I'm going to talk about that as well. If you look at the land resources, sure, we've got the urban sprawl, and we've heard all about that. That's taking over horticultural land. That's been happening for a long, long time. Horticulture, vegetable production was at Gwelup and then in Wanneroo, Carrabuta. Now, it's heading out to West Gingin. So that's something that's happened. And is going to continue to happen. And there's areas like Carrabuta, which are good vegetable growing areas with good soil and water and close to Perth, and it'd be nice to keep those areas if possible. We've also got restrictions in terms of land for horticulture in environmentally sensitive catchments like the Peel Harvey catchment and Ellenbrook, and there's concerns about nutrient loss and pollution of groundwater. I guess the other thing, we may not always have the good soil with good water reserves underneath it. Some of the better soil, say in the Swan Valley, there's not the water there, or the Chewett Sands. So people are forced to go into some of the poorer soil types where there's more concerns about nutrient leaching. And that's sort of driven some of this benchmarking work that I'll talk about, and we'll talk about fertiliser use efficiency. So I mentioned the climate change impacts on irrigated agriculture. So you've probably all seen the southwest of WA, seen the figures that we're going to have less rainfall going forward, which is going to mean there's less recharge and into the aquifer and less runoff. So there's going to be less irrigation water going forward. We've got rising temperatures, extreme weather events. We're actually going to have increased evaporation rates too, because it's going to be hotter. So the crops might need an extra 5 or 10% more water. So it's a bit of a double whammy, really. Have less irrigation water, but the crops are going to need more. This is a graph that some of you may have seen with the rainfall over the last, say, 100 years, and you can see that the red is below average, blue is above average, and that's the moving average, actually, that line. So our rainfall's decreased a lot in the last 100 years in the southwest of WA. And what's predicted to happen going forward, and this is some of the climate change modelling under a fairly high emission scenario, by 2080, roughly the rainfall's going to decrease by another 15%. So we've already had a big drop, and we're going to have another drop going forward. What does that mean for recharge into the groundwater? Generally, if the rain drops by 10%, you're going to have a 20% reduction in recharge, because you need to wet the soil up. Those small rainfall events won't wet it up. So if you've got a 15% reduction in rainfall, as we just saw in the previous slide, you're going to have 30% less water by 2080, according to that modelling. So water allocations will most probably have to be reduced. And so how would growers manage this? You know, really they've got to be more efficient with their water allocation. They could grow less crop, which most of them probably won't want to do because it'll affect their profitability. They could get water from elsewhere, they could buy it in from somewhere else, or they could move down to the southwest of the state. So this leads on to this work that I did and other people did with Perth Region NRM, this benchmarking irrigation and fertiliser use. I was involved with stone fruit growers in the hills, citrus and mango growers up at Gingin, tomato growers at Wanneroo and Karabuta, jujube growers around the state, wine grapes, another consultant did most of that, avocados. So it was quite a big study that went over a couple of years. So if we look at the approach that we took, and if we take, so the tomato guys, for example, we had 10 properties. We went out and interviewed them, the growers, and got their fertiliser, irrigation and spray programs. We took leaf, soil and water samples for nutrient testing. We actually took samples for disease identification to make sure that they were identifying the disease properly and spraying appropriately. Wrote a report for each of the growers, benchmarking them against the other growers in the study in a confidential manner, but also against industry standards. And then we gave them recommendations, you know, specifically on what they needed to do for their fertiliser, irrigation, spraying, etc. Went back and saw the growers again to present the information, held a field day for the wider industry, all the other tomato growers, for example. Follow-up visit a year later or a phone call to see whether we'd made changes with our practice. So it's quite intensive work that was done. I just want to show some of the results of that work. And this is the irrigation water applied, and this happens to be the stone fruit guys in the Perth Hills. So these are, well, there were 13 growers, stone fruit growers, and here's the DPI recommendation. This is megalitres a hectare a year of water applied. Forget about those growers 2, 3 and 9 because they were young trees. All the rest of them had trees of the same size, they're in the same area, pretty much the same leaf area, should be applying roughly the same amount of water. And you can see that some of them are applying, say, 5 megs a hectare, some are applying 10. So some guys are putting on twice as much water as others. And you ask yourself, well, why are they doing this? You know, and what it probably shows, well, what it does show is that some of them were underwatering because some of them didn't have enough water, but some of them are definitely overwatering. And it's not just the stone fruit guys, that was across all the industries. There was such a big range in what people were doing. And not only the total amount, there was variation in when they applied the water. So this is when these stone fruit guys applied the water. Some guys started watering in October, some guys were still watering in April. You know, there's a general trend there, but if you look closely at that, some guys were putting a lot more water on at different times of year to others. So how do we improve irrigation efficiency? The irrigation design the irrigation system needs to put water on uniformly. It's like your front lawn. If you've got a dry patch there, you're going to put more water on that to make it green, so you're going to overwater in other areas. You've got to have a uniform irrigation system. And there's been a couple of projects, more dollars per drop and Waterwise on the farm, that have looked at growers' irrigation systems, and sure, there can be improvements that can be made there. Some of them quite cheaply, others quite more costly for the grower to change. The second question a grower's got is, well, how much water do I put on? And, you know, most of the time growers would look at the plant, scratch the soil, put your finger in the air or whatever, but really we've got a lot more scientific ways now of working out how much water to put on, with soil moisture sensors and using weather station data, looking at the evaporation data and putting on a percentage of the evaporation for different crops and different crop stages. You know, if here we've got a bigger citrus tree, it's going to need more water than these small trees. But in this case, the guy's watering a cover crop in the middle, so he's going to need some more water for that. But he's also got a mulch along the line here. So, you know, you can work out how much water a tree needs, even though you've got all these different variables. You can work out how much water you're going to need to put on a lot more accurately, by using soil moisture sensors, which are now quite cheap, and they're all pretty much these days all logging, so you can get your smartphone, you can have a look at what's happening in the soil and your property, even if you're not on the property. You know, they're becoming more used now, but there's still, I'd say the vast majority of people don't use this sort of equipment. Here's some graphs, and I won't go into them too much detail, but this was on one property, citrus property. This was an example. These are irrigations where overwatering was occurring, because this is the 90 centimetre deep one. That's the topsoil, 30 centimetres, 90. You can see there's a big amount of water going through past the root zone in that situation. So the grower can look at that and see what's happening. Same grower, a bit later on, heat wave came through, didn't increase his irrigation. The moisture content in that top, when the root zone dropped down below the refill point, which is a point that we can set. So if growers don't use evaporation data or soil moisture sensors to work out how much, how do they work out how much water to apply? Well, generally what they do is they put on too much water, because the consequence of underwatering is low yield, poor quality. You don't want to risk it, so they put excessive water on. And on the sandy soils, there's no real consequence of overwatering. You know, and that overwatering can lead to yield decline on heavier soils. You know, maybe up in the Perth Hills it's more of an issue, but it's not so much of an issue on the sands. What it leads to is higher pumping costs, and you're going to leach your nitrogen. Most of that extra water is going to go back down into the aquifer anyhow. But it's going to lead to higher pumping costs, and you're going to leach your nitrogen, which is not good. So why aren't growers spending more time or money on irrigating more accurately? Well, it's because water only costs them about 10% of their total growing costs, right? Labour and all these other costs are a lot higher. So currently there's not the drivers for most people to spend too much time or money on improving their irrigation. But what we do know is when water becomes limiting, like what happened over in the Murray-Darling a while back, that's when growers get really interested in using their water more efficiently. And maybe we're heading to that situation with, as I said, with climate change and with, you know, the groundwater and the hills, and even throughout the state, water's becoming more limiting. But it requires more money and more time for the guys to do it. And it's more difficult when you've got different soil types on the same property, you've got crops at different ages or different crops. You know, like how many sensors do you need? You know, how many calculations do you need to do to work out how you're going to actually do it all? So it can be done, but it requires more time and effort to do it. Okay, so that was the irrigation bit. So also in this benchmarking study, we looked at fertiliser use, and I just want to talk on that briefly as well. So this is some fertiliser information. This was from the tomato growers, and this is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium that they put on, kilograms a hectare of crop. These are the growers. Here's the DPI recommendation. Might be a touch low, I've written there. It's a huge range of fertiliser rates. You know, some guys putting on, let's say, 700, some guys putting on, well, huge amounts of nitrogen they don't need to be putting on. Same with phosphorus. You know, there's some levels there that these guys were putting on, and you just shake your head and go, why are you doing that? And this is the cost of their fertiliser programs. And when we had the field day, I presented this information to some of these guys, and I made them sit up and have a look at, what? I'm spending twice, 3 times as much on my fertiliser as this guy here, all getting roughly the same yield. All the leaf analysis that we did showed that there was no deficiencies in anything. So these guys, some of those guys went back and had a serious look at what they were doing and changed some of their fertiliser practices based on this. But the other interesting point to note is this nitrogen in the irrigation water. So obviously, as I said, you get leaching of nitrogen from quite readily on the sandy soils. The guys that were putting on the highest fertiliser rates, these ones in red, had the highest nitrate in their groundwater. In fact, this guy here had more nitrogen going on. This is the nitrogen from irrigation water in the crop, what's being recycled by his water. It had more nitrogen going on there than what the Ag Department's recommending. So, you know, it's not a good situation. But why are they doing it? So this is an idealised crop response curve. This is the amount of fertiliser, so the amount of nitrogen, and this is the yield. If you under-fertilise, you get a severe yield penalty, so growers don't want to do that. You want to be up, and there's this big flat area up here of the curve where you're getting 100% of your yield with a whole range of fertiliser rates. They don't want to, ideally you want to be putting that amount of nitrogen on there. They don't want to risk being down here, so they put on this amount, which leads to, you know, some of these guys doing what I was talking about. Now, what we can easily bring some of these guys back down here with a bit more science to what's going on, you know, by leaf testing and looking at what's in the crop, by soil testing to seeing what's in the soil and taking account of that in your fertiliser program. You may not need to put all that phosphorus on, for example. You saw with the water analysis, you know, everybody should be doing water analysis, you know, like with the tomato guys there, that much nitrogen in his water that he didn't actually need to put any fertiliser on. So, years ago when I was with the Department of Ag, we used to run these fertiliser training courses over, you know, 2 half days. A lot of these guys don't understand the basics of the soils, of plant nutrition, of what's in a fertiliser. So we ran these courses with the vegetable industry, cut flowers, I think it was table grapes as well. And that's the sort of thing that I think's needed, some of that sort of basic training for some of these guys. And if you want to get more specific and more detailed, the sort of work that I was talking about with this benchmarking, where you go out and you get 10 growers, you know, leaders or, you know, industry people that other people look up to in the industry, spend time with them over a season or two, looking at how they, and looking at what they're doing, how can they improve what they're doing, help them hold their hand while they go through the exercise of doing it. A lot of these guys, they don't have the confidence to go and change what they're doing because they don't really fully understand it. They've got a recipe that they're copying. So, you know, that to me, that's the best approach if you want to get changes to fertiliser use or irrigation use, is to work closely with guys like the Department of Ag used to do years ago. So in summary, I see water availability as the biggest resource threat to horticulture, as you saw with the drying climate. We can make improvements in irrigation and fertiliser use efficiency with a more scientific approach, as I showed, either with soil moisture sensors or getting people to look at weather station data, evaporation data and scheduling the irrigation, or with, you know, leaf, soil and water testing and you know, help from an agronomist. Maybe the impending lack of water may act as a barrier. The impending lack of water may act as a barrier. As a driver, sorry, for improvements in irrigation efficiency. You know, with climate change, maybe there's something we can do. But, you know, I worked in the area when I was with the Department of Ag, and Rowan, Prince, we've been trying for a long time to get growers to work on their fertiliser and irrigation efficiency, and there was a whole lot of reasons why it didn't happen. But I think there may be some changes there, and things can change. Thanks to Perth NRM for funding that work that I was involved with the benchmarking study, and also the Swan River Trust contributed some money to that as well. Thank you. Hey, I'm off the hook.
You're off the hook. We're a bit behind time. We're just trying to make up a little bit of time, so unfortunately no time for questions. Thank you very much, Neil.